Mason Graham out of Michigan is one of the top prospects in the 2025 NFL draft and could be an option for the Jets with the 7th overall pick. There's one big concern people have about the Jets drafting Graham, but it just does not hold up under scrutiny. I'll explain why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Monday, April 21st, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay tuned for the Armada Player of the Week later in the show. Well, today we are going to continue looking at prospects who could be available for the Jets with the 7th overall pick, and we're going to turn our attention to Mason Graham, a defensive tackle out of Michigan, a player I have discussed a lot since the season ended. We're going to talk about how he could fit in as a rookie with the 2025 Jets. We'll talk about the number one criticism I hear about the Jets potentially picking Graham and why it just does not hold up under scrutiny. But let's begin by talking about why the Jets could be interested in Mason Graham. And as I mentioned, this is probably the prospect I've spoken about the most since the season ended in January. And as we've gotten closer to the NFL draft, I'll be honest with you, I've become more and more pessimistic that he'll still be there at 7 because it feels like his stock has risen. And it's not hard to see why. He's a defensive tackle who brings a lot of skills to the table. There are lots of things I like about his game. First of all, he's just got a great first step. He gets under. He just explodes off the ball. And especially when you're talking about playing on the interior at the defensive tackle spot, that's important because there's an old expression: "Low man wins," and that means you're trying. Essentially, it's a battle when you're talking defensive tackles versus guards and centers. Who gets the leverage? And you get the leverage by being the low guy. And when you explode off the ball, you're typically you're able to make first contact with an offensive lineman before they're ready, before they have a center of balance. It gives you a tremendous leverage advantage. It gives you an opportunity to do what you want to do. And I think that Graham's pass rushing moves and even his ability to shed blocks in the run game is better than a lot of people give him credit for. I think that there is a refined skill set when we talk about his ability to use his hands to get off blocks, his ability to kind of attack with a plan. It's a phrase I use a lot with Quinnen Williams, is that he pass rushes with a plan. I feel the same way about Mason Graham. I feel like there's actually a pretty advanced repertoire of moves. And then it's also just the motor. I mean, he plays really. He covers a lot of ground. He doesn't quit until the whistle is blown. You see him follow the ball down the field. I just think that there's a lot to like about him. And one of the things I always try and be careful about in the NFL draft is declaring a prospect a can't miss prospect, because anybody can miss. But I look at Graham's skill set, and I see a skill set that really will translate well to the NFL, at least has a good chance of translating really well to the NFL. And I think that, unless something weird happens, unless he just gets unless he suffers some serious injuries that unexpectedly, or something else weird happens, I think the odds of him being a Pro Bowl caliber player are very high, because I think that when I watch prospects, I try and figure out if he plays like that in the NFL, is he going to have success? And sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes you watch a receiver who's runs a 4.3 40 and he runs past guys in college, but you look at him in the NFL and he doesn't really know how to run routes. He doesn't really know how to use that 4.3 speed, and you can see he's going to have issues. There are other examples out there, like the offensive tackle who is very athletic and can just explode and out athlete any pass rusher. Nobody's going to beat him to the edge, and he's so much bigger, and he's also big and strong, so he can, even if he doesn't use perfect technique, he'll be able to handle the defensive end because he's just so much physically better than the other guy. But when I look at Graham, I see a guy who does things that are going to translate to the NFL. I see a guy who looks NFL ready to me, a guy who looks ready to put a high level in the NFL. I mean, when we talk about his game, really the only nitpick I see is, his arms aren't super long at 32 inches, but I don't know that that's that big of a deal at the defensive tackle spot. Arm length matters. We talk about arm length sometimes, sometimes an offensive lineman, because it is a game of attrition in the trenches, and it's a game of making sure you're balanced. You need to have a good center of gravity, because in the NFL, anybody you go up against is strong. If you don't have a good center of gravity, they'll throw you, they'll toss you aside. But every strength masks a weakness. So like, a wide receiver who's small but is good at creating separation, his lack of size doesn't really matter that much, because he doesn't need to win jump balls in order to get receptions, because if he's got route running ability and can get open, then that replaces the need for size. And for Graham, I think that first step, really alleviates any concerns I might have had about his arm length. And I also think that, we tend to overanalyze prospects. The draft process has become quite an entity in and of itself. It's you try and like find angles that nobody else can. And I think for teams, you have to remember, these are high pressure jobs, being a GM or a head coach or a high ranking executive. Your job could be on the line with any pick. So sometimes you overanalyze things, and sometimes you nitpick weaknesses. Graham's arms are, they're a little small. He doesn't have great length, but I think he makes up for it in so many other ways, especially that first step. Because when you get that first step, you essentially you close the gap. You can make first contact without having long arms, because you're arriving before a guy's out of his stance. And on the interior, guards and centers tend to be less athletic than tackles. Reason for that is, pretty obvious, is that if you're playing guard or center, if a guy goes left or a guy goes right, you'll have help. If you play tackle, you don't have help on the outside. So you really have to cover a lot of ground at tackle, because if a pass rusher is lining up out wide, you have to get out there. You have to be able to exploit out of your stance. So guys like Mason Graham, guys who are explosive athletes at the defensive tackle spot, they create huge matchup problems, because there just aren't a lot of guards equipped to handle somebody with a skill set like that. And he's quick, but he's also pretty sturdy against in the run game. It's always difficult to like translate strength from college to the pros, because in the NFL you're going up against stronger players. But you look against the better competition Graham played against in college, he's anchored pretty well, and I think he's got pretty good technique as a run defender. So again, I think it's something that will translate to the NFL. At the tackle spot's one of the few spots where I do really value run defense. I mean, I think it is a passing league, so a lot of spots on defense, you prioritize their ability against the pass more than against the run. But defensive tackle is a spot in the middle of the line. You got to be able to anchor against the run. If you're getting annihilated against the run, if you're Javon Kinlaw, it's going to create a big problem for your defense, even if you're a decent pass rusher. Well, Graham, I think, anchors pretty well against the run. I think he does a good job holding up against the point of attack. I think he's sturdy. I think he's shown an ability to disengage and make tackles. That's the other thing, is that, you see him, he's got the moves to disengage. So maybe arm length isn't like his best attribute, but he can make up for it in other ways, because he knows what he's doing. He's got good moves. He understands how to use his hands to shed blocks. There's just a lot good there. And again, you can nitpick about certain aspects of his game, but I see a lot of high-end skills. I see skills that are transferable from college to the NFL. And look, you want to make sure you get a high-end player when you're picking 7th overall. Some players are riskier than others. We've talked about some of the players who are a little risky with this pick. I don't think there's a lot of risk if Mason Graham's there at 7. Will he be there at 7? I mean, I'm becoming a little skeptical of that myself. But ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, let's say he makes it to 7. There's one criticism I hear over and over about the Jets potentially picking Graham, and I just don't think this criticism adds up. Does Graham fill the Jets' biggest need? No, he doesn't. But there's more to a pick than just that. And I'll explain what I mean when we continue here on this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Did you know your Fire TV is also an Xbox? Turn any TV into your gaming and entertainment hub with Fire TV Stick 4K devices. No console required. Just grab your paired controller, subscribe or sign on to Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with EA Play included, and you're ready to play. Dive into hundreds of premium titles from EA Sports College Football 25 to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 and Avowed as easily as you stream your favorite shows. It's gaming made simple, and it's all on your Fire TV. With Wi-Fi 6/6E and auto low latency mode advanced technology, Fire TV Stick 4K delivers smoother, more responsive gameplay with lightning fast speeds you need to stay competitive. With 4K streaming, Watch more than 1.5 million movies and TV episodes from your favorite subscribed series like Netflix, Prime Video, Disney Plus, Max, and more. Head to Amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to get started. Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription and compatible controller required. Available on select devices, including Fire Stick TV 4K second generation, Fire Stick 4K Max first and second generation, and Fire TV Cube third generation. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We're talking about Mason Graham out of Michigan, a player I have been very high on through much of the NFL draft process, a player who, when the process began back in January, seemed like had pretty good odds of falling to the Jets at 7 and perhaps being the 7th overall pick. The deeper we've gotten into the process, the more Graham stock has risen. I'm now becoming more and more pessimistic he'll be there at 7. But let's say he makes it to 7 and the Jets are on the clock. There's one criticism I hear over and over about the Jets picking Graham, and I can't say I agree with it. The biggest criticism I hear is it's not about Graham's game. I mentioned there are some concerns about his arm length that people have, but I think most people acknowledge that the odds are very high that Mason Graham's going to be an excellent player. I mean, I think that very likely Pro Bowl or for whatever team he goes to, because he's a guy whose game is NFL built, a guy who's ready to step in and play at a high level right off the bat. The biggest concern is it's one you hear frequently with the Jets every draft year when we're talking about potential picks, pretty much any other team in the league. The complaint is we have bigger needs. And I think that on the merits, that statement's probably accurate. Is defensive tackle the biggest need the Jets have? Well, with Quinnen Williams, you can live with what you've got to a large extent. Quinnen Williams is a guy who anchors a unit. And we've seen, unless you have like a situation last year where Javon Kinlaw is your second tackle, you're probably going to be okay at the defensive tackle spot as long as you've got Quinnen Williams, because he draws so much attention that the guy playing next to him is going to see double teams very infrequently. Quinnen Williams will see most of the double teams, so the other guy's going to get a lot of one-on-ones. And Quinnen Williams, even when he gets double teams, can be disruptive. So yes, in that sense, the Jets do have bigger needs. Is wide receiver a bigger need? Yeah, it probably is. The Jets only have Garrett Wilson there, and unlike defensive tackle, if you have one guy like Quinnen Williams, you can probably get by without having anything else. At wide receiver, if you have one guy, it's tough to operate. You really do need a second guy. At least maybe you don't need a top-notch second receiver, but you at least need a second guy who can occasionally threaten the defense. So that's a need. Right tackle is obviously a need. Not really clear what the plan is for the Jets if they don't get a day one starter at tackle in the draft. I mean, I guess Chukwuma Okorafor would step into the starting lineup, but it would be really tough to have much faith in him. We know tight end tight end's an issue right now. I mean, who's even the starter at tight end? Is it Jeremy Ruckert, I guess? Jeremy Ruckert hasn't even shown he's capable of being a good number 2 tight end right now. So there's a lot of buzz about potentially Tyler Warren being the guy that the Jets pick. So yeah, look, the Jets do have bigger needs. I would have a couple of rebuttals, though. Number one, the Jets still could use an upgrade at that number 2 tackle spot, because despite what I said, there's a difference between we can live with Quinnen Williams and whatever comes after him, and saying that whatever after Quinnen Williams is good. There's this defensive tackle spots behind Quinnen Williams are very, very weak right now for the New York Jets. I think that's difficult to deny. And it's one thing to say we can get by with the other guys as long as we've got Quinnen Williams. It's another to say, like, we've got good players behind Quinnen Williams. The first may be accurate. The second is assuredly not right now. And you also have to consider what happens if Quinnen Williams goes down. Quinnen Williams gets injured, the Jets suddenly have the worst defensive tackle room in the league. So if you draft Mason Graham, first of all, the number 2 tackle spot becomes much better. And you have more insurance if anything happens to Quinnen Williams. Because if Quinnen Williams, as the roster is currently constructed, anything happens to Quinnen Williams, the Jets suddenly become very, very vulnerable as a run defense. And they're not going to be able to generate much of a push up the middle in pass rushing. So there are reasons to want Mason Graham for needs. But the other thing, and this is the bigger point, it's a point that, if you're an everydayer, you've heard me say this a lot, but I'm going to keep saying it because I think it's really important. And I think the message is not always heard. needs matter when we're talking about drafting in the first round. Needs matter less as we get deeper into the draft and the pool of quality players lessens. And maybe, in the first round, though, you can generally get a good player at any position you want. Not always, but not every position. But for the most part, you can be a little selective. But the NFL draft is not only about addressing immediate needs. It's partially, especially the first round, I think needs do come into play. For some teams more than others. For teams with desperate GMs who are on the hot seat, it probably comes into play quite a bit because they're only focused on the here and now. They're focused about getting guys who will step in on day one. But there is more to it. And you have to remember that the draft is a long-term proposition. And you also have to remember that a player's rookie year, in many ways, is his least important because he's still adjusting to the NFL. There are guys who step in and look, especially first rounders, guys who are drafted high, who step in and are great right away. But if you're a good player in the NFL, odds are you improve from year 1 to year 2. The odds are the guy you are in year 3, 4 is different from the guy you are in year 1. You hope at least there's an upward trajectory. So you can't be focused exclusively on what my most immediate need is because that's a great way to make a mistake. And you have to think about, who's the best player for my team 10 years down the line? I mean, I could even go, as recently as 2 years ago. Remember when the Jets drafted Will McDonald? How everybody crushed them. They said, the Jets didn't need a defensive end. What are they doing? Well, let's look at this 2 years out. Will McDonald's coming off a double-digit sack season. And I know, look, I've pointed out that, maybe some of the stuff he did wasn't repeatable, but I think we can say Will McDonald's going to be a good player in the NFL, at least a good pass rusher. Look at the Jets' defensive end spot. If anything, they could use more help at defensive end. If anything, I feel like that defensive end spot, maybe it's not a glaring need, but it's not an overwhelming strength anymore. It's not a strength the way it was 2 years ago. Your needs change from year to year. You might need something one year, you might not need it the next year. So the focus should be on getting great players who are going to prevent positions from being in need. Because if you draft a great player, a guy who's a 10-year starter in the first round, well, then you're not going to have to worry about that position being in need for a decade. And that's what the focus really has to be. The biggest impact does not always come from improving a weakness. Sometimes it comes from turning a spot that's okay into a major strength. And that's where the Jets are at the defensive tackle spot. I mean, with Quinnen Williams, defensive tackle's okay. As long as Quinnen stays healthy, as long as there's no unexpected decline to his game, and I would have no reason to expect that there would be. But if you take Mason Graham and add him to Quinnen Williams, suddenly you have a duo inside. I mean, who's blocking that dude? Who's blocking those two? I mean, how the heck do you, as an offense, work around having Quinnen Williams and Mason Graham on the inside? It becomes an enormous problem for your team. Defensive tackle is not going to be a need for the Jets for the foreseeable future with Mason Graham. And beyond that, you've created an overwhelming strength. You've created a matchup that other teams are going to have a really difficult time dealing with. That might be more important than finding a good tight end. I think there are dimensions of this that people miss. Yes, I'm not saying needs are irrelevant, but people act like it's the only thing that matters. And there's so much more that goes into team building than that. And there's so much more that goes into the NFL draft than that. So respectfully, you may not believe Mason Graham's the best pick for the Jets. And you may have good reasons for that. You may disagree with some of my analysis of his scouting report. You may have other issues. But one thing you should not say is we have bigger needs. Because at the end of the day, the biggest need is finding great players for your team, finding impact players who move the needle. That's the biggest need the Jets have. That's the biggest need any team has. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, let's say the Jets get past the Mason Graham not filling their biggest need and they pick him. What can this team expect from him in year one? Well, I think expectations would need to be high. How high? We'll give you some thoughts on that as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. The Armada Player of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, we're going to look at draft prospects to pick one guy that stands apart, the guy we believe showcased the strength and power needed to push the Jets forward as we look forward to the next season. And this week's Armada and clear-cut Player of the Week is, well, I mean, who else would it be? It's Mason Graham. That's who we're talking about today. He's rugged. He conquers the offensive line with capability and confidence. He's a heavy-duty player. And when it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer. And that's exactly what I think Graham can do here. And I've explained why. And we'll go a little bit ahead on the show. We'll talk about how he'll how he'll change the Jets in 2025 if they pick him. It's clear that our player of the week is out here ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of their outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Monday, we're talking about Mason Graham out of Michigan, a player I would love to see become a New York Jet on Thursday night as we reach the 2025 NFL draft. We've talked about his strengths. We've talked about why the criticism of the Jets picking Graham just really doesn't work. Let's talk about what will happen if the Jets pick Mason Graham. Now, first of all, you'll have a very, very happy podcast on Friday because I will be delighted if that's who the Jets pick. Although I don't know that there's a player out there that I would like immediately rule out the Jets picking. I'm not a big fan of the Jets picking Tyler Warren. If the Jets picked him, I would look. I wouldn't be super positive on it, but I at least would be able to give you a case where it could work out. So I don't know if there's going to be anyone that I would absolutely hate, but I will say that the one of the picks that would make me the happiest would be Mason Graham. So, where would he fit in as a rookie? It's not a lot of these guys. I'll give you like a statistical benchmark. I think defensive tackles is tougher to give you like what good statistics would be, because a lot of what defensive tackles do is dirty work that doesn't always show up in the stat sheet. Now, sometimes it does, but not always. Back when Leonard Williams was with the Jets, he got mocked because he used this phrase "hidden production" that he had, and the phrase was not a good one. You shouldn't say something like hidden production because it makes it sound like it's fake. What he should have said was something more like production that doesn't show up in the stat sheet, because not everything a player does in the NFL produces a stat. And that's particularly true at the defensive tackle spot, because if you're winning your assignment one-on-one, you're not always going to be the guy that makes a tackle, but you could be drawing a double team that makes life really easy on the linebacker. A linebacker doesn't even have to beat a block. Suddenly, the guy supposed to block a linebacker is being is double teaming you, so now the linebacker can just fly in and make a tackle. There's a lot of that. There was Fletcher Cox. He was one of the greatest defensive tackles of his generation during a long career with the Philadelphia Eagles, played 12 seasons in Philadelphia, going to be a Hall of Famer in a few years, probably on the first ballot. He had one season with 10 plus sacks in his entire career. An NFL season is now 17 games. It used to be 16 games. But if you take Fletcher Cox's career, if you look at what he averaged per every 17 games, he averaged about 6 sacks. And a lot of people would tell you 6 sacks out of a defensive tackle is a failure, but the reality is there are seasons where you just get on a roll, or you end up at the right place at the right time a lot, and you post huge numbers. But generally speaking, for defensive tackles, unless you're Aaron Donald or Chris Jones or somebody who's just like an extreme outlier, your production your dominance doesn't always show up in the stat sheet. So I can't give you numbers, but what I would say is, first of all, Mason Graham would have a critical role. He would immediately become the number 2 defensive tackle. And I've seen a few people suggest that he and Quinnen Williams would not fit well together because they're both kind of what are known as under tackles, where you're trying to get them one-on-ones, and I don't really buy that. In the past in the NFL, what you used to have one really big guy whose job was to just absorb a double team at the tackle position, and then the other tackle would be the guy who gets the one-on-ones. But today's NFL, I don't think having a big space eater is as pronounced as it used to be, because you want all 4 of your guys to be able to get to the quarterback. You don't want just one guy eating up space. You want 4 guys who can penetrate. And generally speaking, when Quinnen Williams is on the field, especially if he's not paired with a quality defensive tackle on his side, he's going to be the guy that draws the double teams. I mean, he draws double teams over 60% of the time. And 2 years ago, he drew double teams 70% of the time. That's just a reflection of how dominant he is and how much trouble he gives other teams. With Mason Graham around, if you put him next to Quinnen Williams, well, you're going to pay for doubling Quinnen all the time. So if Graham's either going to be able to feast, or teams are going to have to vary it a little bit. They'll have to double team Graham more, which means Quinnen will get more one-on-one opportunities, and he'll have more opportunities to produce. There's another real benefit to this. because defensive tackles don't play the whole game. Defensive tackles, it's a physical spot. You're taking a pounding the entire game. You have guys firing at you. You have guys hitting you the entire game. You need rest. A good defensive tackle may play 75, 80% of the snaps. You're going to need to take some time off. Well, if Mason Graham's on the team, that essentially means that the Jets will never have to be on the field on defense without either Quinnen Williams or Mason Graham at defensive tackle. So, that's a really good thing because you want to be able to stagger things a little bit, and that you'll have at least one dominant defensive tackle on the field at all times. And when they're both on the field, it's going to be really tough because, again, you can only double team one of them. And you think about this, you get into a passing down, you got Quinnen Williams at one defensive tackle spot and Mason Graham at the other. And then on defensive end, you've got Will McDonald out wide and healed Jermaine Johnson at the other defensive end spot. Who's blocking that? How the heck do you block that? It's going to make the defensive ends better because there's going to be so much focus up the middle. Teams may. These guys, this defensive tackle duo will be so tough to block that you may have to angle a tight end near the middle of the formation to help out at blocking. You may need to have your running back help with a chip on a tackle instead of out on the edge. So they're going to have less help on the edge, and Aaron Glenn's going to blitz a lot. So there's going to be even less free blockers to help out on these two tackles. And as we know in the NFL, the middle is the spot where you want to dominate on defense. If you can't block the middle of the defensive line, you got trouble. You can't block the edges, you're in trouble. But at least if you can't block the edges, there are going to be places where the quarterback can step up in the pocket if the middle's blocked. If the middle's not blocked, that's your step-up lane. You can't do anything there. And then you'll have Sauce Gardner, locking down the other team's number one receiver. Suddenly this becomes a defense that can win you games if Justin Fields shows any sort of improvement. Suddenly the Jets could be a team that wins more games than you expect. So I think there are a lot of exciting possibilities with Mason Graham. I think he'd step in, he'd be the number two tackle. He'd see a lot of snaps. He'd probably see 70% of the snaps. He and Quinnen Williams would be a dominant 1-2 punch. When Quinnen Williams needs a rest, Mason Graham becomes the guy at the tackle position. I think there'd be a lot to like about this pick. I don't know if he's going to make it. I'm hoping he'll make it. If he does, I think there's a strong possibility he should be the pick. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.